In this step, let's get started with creating a Spring Boot project. Creating a Spring Boot project is very easy. All that you need to do is go to the website start.spring.io. This is called Spring Initializr. Over here, you can make a few simple choices and get started with your Spring Boot project. I will choose Maven as my build tool. I'll choose Java as the language. We are recording this course with Spring Boot 3. Right now for Spring Boot 3, there are snapshot versions and milestone versions. Therefore, I would choose milestone version. If by the time you're watching this course, there is a released version for Spring Boot, if there is a version without snapshot or M1 or M2 or M3, something like 2.7.1 in here. So if you see 3.1.0 or 3.2.0 or 3.3.0, go ahead and use that. For now, the latest milestone release of Spring Boot 3 is 3.0.0 M3, and I'm going to make use of that. One recommendation, do not use snapshot versions. Snapshot versions are versions under development. These are being actively developed by the Spring and Spring Boot teams, and therefore you should avoid them as much as possible. The next thing we would want to configure is the project metadata. Group ID and the artifact ID are very, very similar to your class name and package name. When I create a class, I give it a name and I put it into a package. Similarly, when I create a project, I would need to give it an artifact ID and also place it into a group. The group I'm going to make use of in here is com.in28minutes.springboot. And the artifact ID I would give is learn-spring-boot. I will choose the defaults for the rest of the values in here. Spring Boot 3 needs at least Java 17. So you can use Java 17 or a higher version of Java. At In 28 Minutes, we always ensure that our courses are compatible with the latest version of Spring Boot and Java. So do not hesitate in making use of the latest versions. The last thing we would need to configure in here are the dependencies. We would want to create a Spring Boot project. What kind of project do we want to build? We would want to build a REST API. And to be able to build REST API, we would need a dependency. What's the dependency? It's called Spring Web. This is actually Spring Boot Starter Web. This is used to build web applications and REST API with Spring MVC. This uses Apache Tomcat as embedded container. So let's choose Spring Web. And now we are ready to create our Spring Boot project. All that you need to do now is to click the generate button in here. This would generate a zip file and download it to your downloads folder. As you can see, creating a new Spring Boot project is very, very easy. What I've done is I've extracted the zip file in my downloads folder to a folder on my hard disk. You can choose a convenient folder on your hard disk, something like C:/. Once you have all the code in a specific folder, we are now ready to import it into our IDE. I have already launched up Eclipse and I have chosen a default workspace. And we would want to now import the project into Eclipse. You can either do a file import or you can click import projects in here. So in the file menu, you can choose import or you can click import projects in here. And over here, I would type in Maven. If you type in Maven, you would see something called existing Maven projects come in. So file import existing Maven projects, click next. And I would recommend you to browse to the directory where you have extracted your zip file to. I've extracted my zip file to this specific folder in here. So I'll say open. You'd see a pom.xml come up. And you'd see its group ID and artifact ID. Com in 28 minutes Spring Boot, learn Spring Boot. This will match the group ID and the artifact ID that we configured in here. Let's now go ahead and say finish. If this is the first time you are making use of this specific version of Spring Boot, the import would take a long time, typically about 10 to 15 minutes. If you have any problems, one thing I would recommend you to do is to use the latest version of Eclipse IDE for Java enterprise developers. Once the project is imported in, you should see a structure like this in your project explorer. Source main Java is where your Java code or the source code would go in. This is your application configuration, source main resources, and source test Java is where you write your unit tests. You would see that there are a lot of Maven dependencies which are coming in. And you will see a file called pom.xml where you would see a couple of dependencies which are defined. Spring Boot Starter Web and Spring Boot Starter Test. All the dependencies which you see in here, the Maven dependencies which are in here, are coming in because of these two starter projects. We will discuss a lot about starter projects as we go further in the specific section. For now, let's focus on getting this application up and running. The way you can do that is by going to source main Java, opening up com in 28-minute Spring Boot learn Spring Boot package, and you should see a file called learn Spring Boot application.java. This file has a main method, and this main method is what we would want to launch up. So I'll say right click, run as Java application, and this would launch our Java application up. If you go to the end of the logs, you would see that Tomcat is started on port 8080. And you will see that this application started up very, very quickly, less than a second. In this step, we created a Spring Boot project. We saw that it was very, very easy to create a Spring Boot project using Spring Initializr. All that we needed to do was to make a few choices and click the generate button. A project was created. We imported that project into Eclipse and we were able to also launch it up. The application was launched in Tomcat server on a specific port. You also saw that a lot of logs are generated. How is this magic happening? How does Spring Boot work? To understand that, we'll build a simple REST API using Spring Boot. You will see that this will not take more than a few minutes. I'll see you in the next step.